The council chamber had no windows. Every new diplomat noticed this sooner or later. There was nothing to look at except each other, 73 species arranged in a perfect circle under cold white light. No stars, no sky, just walls of dark polished stone and the faces of beings who had decided, a very long time ago, that they were the ones in charge of the galaxy. Ambassador Greel of the Tharan had sat in this chamber for 60 years. His skin had gone from pale brown to ash gray over that time. His 3 eyes moved slowly now, the way old eyes do when they have seen enough to stop being surprised. He had watched wars begin and end in this chamber. He had watched entire species voted into irrelevance. He had watched confident delegates make decisions that turned out to be the worst decisions anyone had ever made, and then watched those same delegates explain afterward why it had been someone else's fault. He was about to watch another one. The chair recognized him. He stood. The chamber settled into the particular quiet that came when someone old and respected was about to speak. The kind of quiet that means we are listening, which is not the same as the kind that means we will hear you. The species designated H7 in the catalog, Greel said, commonly referred to as humans, single-planet civilization, mid-rim solar system. I am formally requesting that this council reconsider the military action currently authorized against their territory. Council leader Voss of the Keth leaned forward in the primary seat. Voss was tall, silver-skinned, broad across the shoulders, and wore the flat and patient expression of someone who had made up their mind 3 days ago and was now performing the courtesy of a listening face. The Keth had run the council for 200 years, which they had managed through a combination of economic power, strategic marriages between their noble houses and the noble houses of 6 other species, and a remarkable talent for making every decision feel like it had already been settled before the meeting started. Ambassador Greel, Voss said, this matter was voted on at the last session. The humans are in violation of territorial expansion protocols. Their colony ships are in protected space. The corrective fleet has been authorized, crewed, and is currently sitting at departure coordinates. The operation begins in 6 hours. I know, Greel said. I am asking you to recall it. The silence that followed was not polite. The humans, Voss continued, his voice measured and very reasonable, are a Class 3 civilization. They have possessed faster-than-light travel for 11 years. Their military force consists of fewer than 20 vessels capable of deep space engagement. Their technology is below the Council average across nearly every category we measure. This is a standard correction operation. We send 40 ships. They see 40 ships. They comply. The colony ships return to approved space. The matter closes in a week. Their technology is below average, Greel agreed. Their weapons are not. Voss tilted his head. Explain. Greel opened the data he had been compiling for 3 years. It projected into the center of the chamber in bright, sharp detail. Weapons tests, battle records, historical footage, some of it extremely old by human standards, some of it very recent, all of it recorded by the humans themselves, preserved carefully in public archives, taught to their children in schools, and in a number of cases adapted into entertainment that millions of humans watched voluntarily in their free time. That last part had always bothered Greel the most. The humans have been at war continuously for the full extent of their recorded history, he said. There is not a single century in their historical record without a major armed conflict. They have fought over land, water, food, religion, political theory, old borders, new borders, borders that were wrong when they were drawn, inheritance disputes, trade agreements, broken trade agreements, and in at least 4 documented cases, arguments that began as trade disputes and became wars before anyone clearly understood how. He paused. During their 20th century, very recent by any galactic measurement, they built weapons capable of destroying entire cities in a single detonation. They built these weapons not to use against other species, to use against each other. They constructed enough of these weapons to destroy their own planet several times over. They then spent the better part of 50 years in a political standoff, each side pointing these weapons at the other side, arguing about whether the number they had was sufficient or whether they needed more. Council member Drahl of the Sen raised a thin hand. The Sen were small, careful, precise beings who had built most of the Council's communication networks and tended to approach everything, including genocide, with the manner of someone reviewing an engineering specification. Drahl looked politely skeptical, which on a Sen face was simply the default expression. Ambassador, every species with a long enough history has chapters of violence. What you're describing sounds like a species that was primitive and has, presumably, grown beyond. 11 years ago, Greel said, the humans encountered a species called the Vreth. Drahl stopped. The Vreth were a Class 4 civilization, Greel continued. More advanced than the humans by several decades, better ships, stronger weapons by the standard metrics we use. The Vreth decided that this new species they had found was a resource to be managed, that human-occupied systems were available for Vreth use, that the humans, being younger and smaller and weaker, would accept this position. He looked around the chamber. The Vreth no longer exist. The chamber went very still. That war lasted 9 months, Greel said. The humans were 4 years into space travel when it started. They lost ships. They lost colony stations. They lost people. And then they adapted, rebuilt their tactics from the ground up, and prosecuted that war to a conclusion so complete that our best intelligence teams have not been able to find a single surviving Vreth vessel. He gave that a moment. I have spent 3 years studying this species, he said. I have read every piece of intelligence we have gathered. I have consulted with 6 xenobiologists, 2 military historians, and a behavioral analyst who specializes in civilizations that emerged from high-conflict evolutionary environments. I have read the humans' own historical records, which they keep in extraordinary detail, apparently because they believe it is important to remember what they are capable of. He paused. My conclusion is this: humans do not surrender, they do not accept a subordinate position, they do not stop. Their entire recorded history follows the same pattern. They absorb the initial blow, they take casualties, they adapt, and they do not stop until the conflict is finished completely on their terms. Council member HFY of the Duvani spoke up from the 4th ring. The Duvani were an old species, slow-moving and thoughtful, who had been in the council since the early days. HFY's voice was low and careful. Greel, I hear what you're saying, but you're talking about a species that has had 11 years in space, against 40 of the Council's best vessels. I do not see how the mathematics favor them regardless of how aggressive their history is. The mathematics of the first day do not favor them, Greel said. I am asking you to think about the mathematics of the first year, of the second year. Greel, Voss's voice had developed a slight edge, the kind that meant the patience was running thin. We are not invading their home system. We are not threatening their civilian population. We are not demanding tribute or conquest. We are sending 40 vessels to escort a handful of colony ships back to approved space. That is all. If we allow a Class 3 civilization to violate territorial protocols without any response simply because they have an aggressive history, what message does that send to every other species that is watching? It sends the message that we are being careful, Greel said. It sends the message that we are afraid of a species that has been in space for 11 years, Voss replied. And we are not. You should be, Greel said simply. The chamber had not been this quiet all session. Voss looked at him with something that was not quite anger and not quite respect, somewhere between them. Is that your official position, Ambassador? Voss said. It is my official position, Greel said, that humans are not a species that responds to shows of force the way other species respond to shows of force. Most civilizations, when they see 40 warships in their solar system, perform a rational calculation, and decide that the territorial dispute is not worth the cost. Humans perform a different calculation. They look at 40 warships and decide what they need to build to fight 40 warships. He looked around the chamber. They have had 11 years to build. Council member Drawl spoke again. Ambassador, with the greatest respect, you are theorizing about a response that has not happened. We don't know that they'll fight. We don't know that they won't, Greel said. And the difference between those two possibilities is 40 ships and every crew member on them. The vote had already been taken. He had known that when he stood up. He had known 3 days ago, when the vote was cast, that nothing he said today would change the outcome. The fleet was sitting at departure coordinates with its crews already briefed and its weapons already powered. This was not a debate anymore. This was a record. He needed it on the record. He needed Zara, his young aide sitting in the gallery behind him, to hear it and remember it. She was 40 years old, young for a Tharan. She would outlive most of the delegates in this room by a century. She would need to know, when the time came, that someone had stood up and said something. The correction fleet departs in 6 hours, Voss said. The operation is expected to conclude within the week. Ambassador Greel's concerns are noted. He said the last word in the specific tone of someone nodding something they will file and never open again. This session is closed. Greel sat down. Zara leaned forward from the gallery and touched his shoulder. You tried, she said quietly. Yes, he said. He was looking at the data projection still hanging in the center of the chamber. The small yellow star in the midrim, the blue planet orbiting it. From this distance, represented as a point of light in a star chart, it looked like nothing at all. Now we wait, he said. Admiral HFY of the Keth military had 40 ships and a reasonable level of confidence in the outcome. He had run 3 correction operations before this assignment. All of them had ended quickly and without significant trouble. Most species, when they saw 40 Keth warships materialize in their solar system, calculated their odds immediately and decided that whatever the original dispute was about, it was not worth the cost of resistance. That was the point of the fleet. The Council did not want combat. It wanted compliance. You sent ships big enough that compliance was the obvious choice, and most of the time it worked. He dropped out of FTL at the edge of the human solar system at 400 Standard Time, looked at his sensor readout, and felt the first small thing he could not name. Why, he said to his navigation officer, are there so many satellites? The human solar system was loud. That was the only word for it. It broadcast constantly across every electromagnetic band, radio signals, radar pulses, tight beam communications bouncing between dozens of objects. There were satellites in every orbital band around every major planet. Tracking platforms, communication relays, weather stations, navigation beacons, construction platforms, military sensors. The system had been filled up with machines over decades, built before the humans had ever left their planet, maintained and expanded since. It felt less like a solar system and more like a city that had been wired for sound. They tracked us the moment we came out of FTL, his sensor officer said. Their long-range detection grid is thorough. Of course it was. They had built it to watch each other. Send the correction notice, HFY said. Standard format. We are here to escort their colony ships back to approved space. Non-compliance will result in escalation. Include the Council authorization codes. The message went out. 22 minutes later, fast, by interstellar communication standards, a response came back. Clean signal, well translated. Whoever had written it spoke the trade language with precision. Message received. Please provide the specific legal documentation supporting the territorial restriction order, including applicable Council charter references and the jurisdictional mapping records for the disputed zones. Our advisory team is reviewing the matter and will respond promptly. We thank you for the communication and look forward to a productive dialogue. HFY read it twice. They said thank you, his communications officer observed. I see that. He read it a third time. Something about it felt off, though he could not point to any specific word. It was perfectly polite. It was technically compliant. They had received the message. They were reviewing it. They were not refusing. They were not complying either. Send the full documentation, he said. Every charter reference, every territorial map, the full legal basis. And include a second notice that this fleet is authorized for enforcement action if the colony ships are not recalled within 48 standard hours. He sent everything. The response came back in 11 minutes. Thank you for the thorough documentation. Our team is reviewing the relevant provisions carefully. We have some questions about the specific jurisdictional application to the zones in question, and would welcome a direct communication channel to clarify these points. We expect to have a full response for you shortly. 40 warships. Waiting while humans did legal research. He moved the fleet forward to the boundary marker. He put it in full combat configuration, weapons powered, engines lit, the formation arranged to show maximum size. It was the kind of image that had ended 3 previous operations before a single shot was fired. When other species saw this formation at close range, they understood very quickly that the conversation was over. Another human message arrived. We observe your fleet's repositioning. We want to be straightforward with you. We have moved our own defense vessels to precautionary positions in response. We want to be clear that we are not seeking conflict and remain committed to dialogue. We are equally clear that we cannot comply with the colony ship recall order, based solely on the Council's assertion of authority over zones that our legal team believes fall outside the established jurisdictional boundary. We look forward to resolving this through communication. Clear, firm, reasonable in tone. Not a single word of fear in any of it. HFY pulled up the tactical display. The human ships had moved. He had located 12 of them, older designs than his own vessels, smaller hull mass, less armor, by every standard measurement outmatched. They were not in defensive formation, protecting their planet. They were in his way, blocking his approach vector. 12 ships, positioned between 40 and their destination, in a formation that communicated one thing clearly: you will have to go through us to get there. They know the numbers, his tactical officer said slowly, almost to himself. Yes, HFY said, they know. He sat with that for a moment. He thought about the Tharan ambassador's speech, which he had read in summary on the long transit here. He remembered one word: excessive. He had not given it much thought at the time. Political dramatics, he had assumed. The kind of speech old delegates made when they wanted to establish a reputation for caution. He thought about it now, looking at 12 ships that had placed themselves between his fleet and their target. He sent his report to the Council, professional and measured. The humans were not complying with the correction notice. He was requesting authorization for the next stage. He used clean language and kept his tone flat. He left out the feeling he could not name, because that kind of thing did not belong in a military report. He should have found a way to put it in. Greel received the report 2 hours later in the Tharan delegation's private corridor, the one with windows. He read it standing up, watching the stars through the glass. Zara stood beside him. They blocked the fleet, she said, reading over his shoulder. 12 ships against 40. Yes. She was quiet then. Is that brave or is it stupid? Greel folded the report. He had been asked versions of this question many times over the past 3 years, whenever he tried to explain his conclusions about humanity to colleagues who had not studied the species. With humans, he said, those two things have a great deal of overlap. They don't seem to distinguish between them the way other species do. It's part of what makes them very difficult to predict. He looked at the stars. HFY will see the formation as a bluff. He'll advance. The humans won't move. and then someone will fire a shot. Zara sat down in the corridor chair. The weight of what he was not saying was settling on her. He could see it in how she held her shoulders. And after that, she asked. After that, everything that follows will be the Council's doing. But the Council will not see it that way. They will call it the humans' fault for not standing down. They will send more ships. The humans will adapt and fight harder. The Council will call for more ships again. He paused. You understand where the pattern goes. How does it end? Griel looked at the dark between the stars, at the patch of sky where a small yellow sun was burning somewhere too far to see. He thought about a species that had fought itself for 10,000 years without ever permanently stopping. That had survived plagues, famines, and disasters of its own making, and had each time rebuilt and begun again. That had developed weapons capable of ending itself completely, had pointed those weapons at its own civilization for 50 years, and had not fired them, not because it was peaceful, but because it was strategic enough to know that it wanted to win, and winning required not being dead. A species that, when it decided something was a threat, did not panic. It planned. The Keth, he said, are sending a correction fleet to manage a species that once fought a global war with propeller-driven aircraft and explosives dropped from the sky, lost more people than most species have ever had, spent 4 years doing it, and then immediately started preparing for the next one. He turned from the window. They are not being corrected. They are being given a reason. A reason for what? Zara asked. Griel picked up the report and walked toward the main corridor. To stop being cautious, he said. The first shot was not fired by the humans. That fact would matter later. It would matter a great deal. But in the moment, on the bridge of the Keth flagship, it did not feel like a historical event. It felt like a ship that had stopped responding to orders. Admiral HFY had advanced the fleet slowly, deliberately. He had moved toward the human formation over the course of 6 hours, closing the distance in careful increments, giving the humans time to see what was coming and make the rational decision. He had continued sending messages, polite messages, firm messages, and finally, a very direct message that left no ambiguity about what would happen if they did not clear the approach vector. The human response to the final message had been, "We understand your position clearly. Our position remains unchanged. We are not moving." 5 words at the end. We are not moving. He had ordered the forward squadron to fire warning shots, controlled bursts, not aimed at the human ships directly, aimed at the space in front of them, close enough to read as a final statement. It was a tactic that had worked twice before against smaller civilizations. The human ships moved. Not back, not away. Forward. They came in fast and close, inside the range where Keth weapons were designed to operate most effectively, and they spread out wide, forcing his formation to split its fire across too many angles. HFY had not expected this. His tactical models had assumed the humans would either retreat or hold position and take the hits. They had not assumed the humans would accelerate toward 40 warships like the numbers were a suggestion rather than a fact. 3 of his ships were hit in the first exchange before his gunners had properly adjusted their targeting. 3 ships in the opening minutes. What are they shooting with? His tactical officer said. The question hung there for a moment because it did not have a clean answer. The human weapons were not sophisticated by Council standards. The delivery systems were older technology, but the warheads were dense, heavy. They hit like something considerably larger than they should have been, and they kept hitting because the human pilots did not pull back after the initial pass. They came around again and again. They're not retreating between passes, his sensor officer said, surprised. They're staying in close. I can see that, HFY said. He had 40 ships. He had used similar engagements to model this one. The models had said the humans would fire, absorb return fire, take damage that their smaller hulls could not sustain, and withdraw. The models had not considered that the humans might decide the models were wrong and fight accordingly. They were not fighting like a force expecting to win. They were fighting like a force that had decided losing slowly was unacceptable, and losing fast was at least honest. It took 40 minutes to disable or destroy all 12 human ships. HFY sat in his command chair and looked at the after-action readout for a long time. He had lost 6 vessels, not destroyed, damaged badly enough to pull out of the engagement. He had another 4 ships with significant hull damage that would need repairs before they were combat effective again. He had killed 12 ships with 22 of his own at full capacity. He had expected to lose none. "Send the report to the council," he said quietly. "Tell them the correction operation has encountered resistance. Tell them the human defense force has been neutralized. And tell them—" He stopped. He looked at the numbers again. "Tell them I need replacement vessels before proceeding to the colony ship location." His communications officer sent the report. HFY sat with the numbers: 12 human ships, not modern ships, not well-armed ships by standard measurements. 6 of his vessels pulled out of action, and the humans had not stopped fighting until they were physically unable to continue. Not one of them had broken formation. Not one had requested terms. He thought about the Tharan ambassador's word again. Excessive. The report reached the council chamber 8 hours later. Voss read it at the primary seat, and his expression did not change, which was itself a kind of expression. 6 vessels damaged, said Council Member Drahl of the Sen, reading the same report at his own station. That's a significant ratio for a Class 3 civilization. They caught our admiral off his expected parameters, Voss said. It won't happen again. We send reinforcements. The operation continues. Of course, said Drahl. He had a very small pause before the words that was almost nothing at all. Greel had been given a copy of the report as a courtesy. He read it in the Tharan corridor and then sat very still for a while. Zara brought him a cup of the hot liquid he drank when he needed to think, a Tharan grain tea that smelled like wood and old rain. She sat across from him and waited. 6 ships, she said eventually. 6 ships on the first day, Greel said. Against 12 opponents they had every material advantage over. Is that? It tells us several things, he said. First, the humans did not build their 12 ships for standard combat. They built them for this specific kind of fight, close, aggressive, high risk. They made choices in the design that a civilization expecting easy victory would not make. They expected to be outnumbered. They built for it. Zara was quiet. Second, Greel said, 12 ships against 40, and not one of them requested terms or broke away from the engagement. Maybe their communications were down. They were sending messages to HFY 6 minutes before the last ship was disabled, Greel said. Their communications were fine. He picked up his tea. They chose not to ask for terms. Why? Greel thought about it for a moment. In human military culture, he said, there is a concept. Not surrendering is not simply a tactical choice for them. It is tied to something in their identity, something old. Their history is full of examples of forces that were completely surrounded, completely outgunned, facing certain destruction and chose to keep fighting anyway. Not because they expected to win, because stopping felt like something worse than dying. Zara looked at him. That sounds irrational, Greel said. Yes, deeply irrational, and also extremely effective if you are trying to convince an enemy that defeating you will cost more than it is worth. He set down the cup. The council will send reinforcements. HFY will proceed. He will push through to the colony ships and he will escort them back. And the humans will call that a victory for the council. But the humans will also call it a data point, he said. They now know exactly how a Keth fleet fights. They know the weapon ranges, the formation tactics, the response times. They lost 12 ships. They damaged 6 of ours. And every human military analyst in their system is right now working out what 12 ships with a different design philosophy could have done. He stood up. The Council thinks this is over, he said. The humans are just getting started. Admiral Chen Wei of the Earth Defense Force stood in the debriefing room at Lunar Station and listened to the tactical breakdown of the engagement with the flat, attentive face of someone absorbing every number personally. He was not a tall man. He had gray at his temples and a scar along his left jaw from a training accident 20 years ago. He had commanded ships for most of his adult life and had the specific stillness of someone who had learned that panic was a resource you spent, and once spent you could not get back. Around him sat 12 officers, the survivors of the 12-ship forward defense group. All of them were alive because they had been recovered from disabled ships, not because any of those ships had made it through the engagement intact. They looked tired. Several of them had bandaged injuries. None of them looked like they had lost. The tactical officer finished his breakdown. Chen Wei looked at the holographic display in the center of the table. The engagement mapped out in clean lines and vectors. 40 Keth ships, 12 human ships, 6 Keth vessels pulled out with serious damage, 12 human ships disabled or destroyed. What did we learn? Chen Wei said. The room spoke. Everyone contributed. They talked for 2 hours. Formation weaknesses in the Keth advance line, response delay patterns, the specific range brackets where Keth weapons were optimized and the gaps between those brackets, the way Keth gunners recalibrated after the first pass and how long that recalibration took, the fact that the Keth ships had not been expecting close-range engagement and had been positioned for longer standoff fire. Chen Wei listened to all of it and added it to the picture he was building. "They'll come back with more ships," said Commander Ackefer, his most senior surviving pilot. Sarah Ackefer was young, mid-30s, which in space combat terms meant experienced, with the particular focused energy of someone who thought 3 moves ahead in every conversation. The Council isn't going to accept that result as an endpoint. "No," Chen Wei said. "They'll classify this as an obstacle and route around it." He looked at the display. "They'll expect us to be weaker now, fewer ships, damaged stations. They'll expect us to have spent our capacity." "We spent 12 ships," Ackefer said. "We spent 12 ships," Chen Wei agreed, "and we built 40 more in the last 8 months." He let that sit for a moment. "The 12 out there were old. They were the ships we could afford to lose. The fleet we actually have, the Council has never seen." The room was quiet for a moment. "So what's the plan?" one of the junior officers asked. Chen Wei looked at the Keth fleet position on the display, still sitting at the engagement point, still sending correction notices. He had been told, in between repair operations, very formal language, still calling it a correction operation even now. "They think this is a colonial dispute," Chen Wei said. "A territorial argument that got a little heated. They're going to send more ships, push harder, and expect us to do the rational calculation and decide compliance is cheaper than continued resistance." He straightened. "We need to change what they think this is." "How?" Ackefer asked. Chen Wei looked at the star chart, the 40 Keth ships, the route they would take, the supply lines running back to Keth space, the communication relays they depended on to coordinate with the Council, the 3 staging bases they had set up in the outer system to manage the operation. "We make it expensive," he said. "Not just here, we make it expensive everywhere they touch." The Council authorized the reinforcement fleet 4 days after HFY's report. 20 additional vessels. Enough, the Keth military planners said, to make the point impossible to ignore. Greel read the authorization memo and requested an emergency session. He was told one was not necessary. He requested it again. He was told more firmly that it was not necessary. He wrote a formal letter to Voss directly. In the letter he noted, with as much restraint as he could manage, that the humans had damaged 6 Council warships with 12 of their own older vessels, and that this ratio suggested the 12 vessels were not a representative sample of human military capability. He noted that the humans had had 8 months of warning since the territorial dispute became active. He noted that humans, in their own historical record, had a pattern of appearing to absorb an initial blow while building for a response. He requested that the Council attempt formal diplomatic communication before the reinforcement fleet arrived in system. Voss's response was brief and professional. It thanked him for his concern. It confirmed the reinforcement fleet was departing as scheduled. Greel set the response down on his desk and looked at it for a long time. Zara came in. She had been monitoring the feeds from the human system, what little the Council's intelligence network could pull. She had a look on her face that Greel had learned to read over the 40 years she had served as his aide. It was the look that meant she had found something he was not going to like. "What is it?" he said. "Our intelligence contact in the outer system detected a new signal pattern 6 hours ago," she said. "Coming from the human side, tight beam, heavily encrypted, going to at least 11 different locations simultaneously." "What locations?" "That's what he couldn't determine," she said. "The encryption is too good for our current tools, but 11 directions simultaneously, that's not a distress call. That's not a colony coordination signal. That's a command network," Greel said. "Yes." He stood up slowly. 11 locations, he said, simultaneously. He walked to the window. "They're not defending a planet, they're coordinating something across 11 locations at once." He stood there for a long moment. "How long has that signal been active?" "The contact thinks at least 48 hours, Zara said. "It may have been running longer in a dormant pattern we didn't catch." Greel pressed his palm flat against the window glass. The reinforcement fleet was already in transit. 20 more ships heading toward the human system. 20 ships and every crew member on them, heading toward a species that had just lost 12 of its older vessels and was already talking to 11 separate locations across the system in encrypted command language. "Send a message to HFY," Greel said. "On my personal authority. Tell him to wait for the reinforcement fleet before advancing. Tell him not to push toward the colony ships until he has the full force assembled. Tell him the humans are coordinating something and that his current fleet should hold position." "You don't have the authority to issue tactical orders to a Keth admiral," Zara said carefully. "No," Greel said, "but I can send a message as a fellow sentient being asking him to be careful." He turned from the window. "Send it anyway. He will probably ignore it, but send it." She sent it. HFY did not respond. He was already moving. HFY advanced his fleet on the morning of the 5th day. He had 34 ships at full capacity. 6 were still undergoing repairs at the outer staging base. He had decided not to wait for them. The reinforcement fleet would arrive in 6 days, and by his calculation, he could reach the colony ship location and begin the escort operation well before then. The human defense force was gone. The path was clear. Waiting served no purpose except to give the humans time they did not deserve. He moved in standard formation, tight, orderly, the way a force moves when it expects no opposition. He was 40 minutes into the advance when his sensor officer said, very quietly, "Admiral, I'm reading new contacts." "From where?" "From everywhere." HFY looked at the display. The new signals were not coming from the direction of Earth. They were coming from the asteroid belt, from the outer planet orbital stations, from deep system positions that his initial survey had logged as inactive mining infrastructure, from places where nothing military should have been sitting for the past 8 months. 40 ships, human ships, new designs he had not seen before. Not 12. 40. And they were already moving. Commander Sarah Akafer had been waiting in the belt for 11 days. Her ship, the Carthage, was a heavy strike vessel, one of the new class that Earth had been building quietly for 2 years, classified at a level that meant even most of the Defense Force hadn't known they existed until 6 months ago. She had a crew of 214 people, and a weapons payload that the old design philosophy would have called disproportionate. Admiral Chen Wei called it appropriate. She had spent 11 days sitting cold and dark in the asteroid belt, running minimal systems, waiting for HFY to do exactly what he had just done. Move early. Move without waiting for his reinforcements. Move because the path looked clear. It looked clear because they had made it look clear. "All ships confirm ready," said her tactical officer. "Confirm," she said. "Relay to the fleet. We execute on the Admiral's mark." The mark came. 40 human ships came out of the dark from 11 different directions at once. The battle lasted 4 hours. HFY fought it well, which mattered and also did not matter. He was a competent commander who had been handed an impossible situation by people who had told him it would be a simple operation. He reorganized his formation fast. He distributed fire effectively. He made good decisions in the time he had to make them. It was not enough. The human ships were faster than anything his intelligence files had described. They were armed heavier than anything that should have fit inside their hull classifications. And they fought in a way that Keth tactical doctrine had no ready answer for: constantly moving, never holding a position long enough to be targeted cleanly, attacking the edges and the weak joints of his formation instead of pushing at the center. They did not fight like a force trying to destroy him. They fought like a force trying to come apart his formation one piece at a time, which was worse, because a formation coming apart is harder to command than a formation taking damage. 17 of his ships were disabled or destroyed before he gave the order to fall back. HFY had never given a retreat order in his career. He gave one now because the alternative was losing all 34 ships instead of 17. He pulled back to the outer system with what he had left, 17 ships, half of them with significant damage. He sat in his command chair and looked at his readout and thought about the speech that Greel had given in the council chamber and how he had filed it in the same place in his mind as the other old delegate speeches. The place where you put things you have listened to without actually hearing. He sent his report to the council. This time he did not keep his tone flat. The report hit the council chamber like a physical thing. Voss read it standing up, which he never did. He read it twice. Then he set it down on the primary desk very carefully, the way you set something down when you want to throw it. 17 vessels, said Council Member HFY of the Duvani. He said it slowly, as if saying it slowly might make the number different. Against 40 human ships. The human ships were not in our intelligence files, Voss said. They were built covertly. HFY could not have anticipated. Ambassador Greel anticipated it, HFY said. The chamber went tight. Drawl of the Sen was already pulling data. If the humans built 40 ships in secrecy in 8 months, he said, and they were capable of engaging our fleet at this ratio, then their production capacity is significantly higher than our Class 3 assessment indicated. He paused. Significantly higher. We update the assessment, Voss said. We respond accordingly. How many more ships are we sending? HFY asked. As many as it takes, Voss said. HFY looked at him. I want to understand what that means. As many as it takes. Our fleet is not unlimited. We have commitments in 7 other contested zones. If we begin pulling major fleet resources toward a single system, we will not be seen backing down from a Class 3 civilization, Voss said. The edge in his voice was not slight anymore. It was all the way there. That conversation is finished. The chamber went quiet. Not everyone in it agreed. Greel could see it in the way several delegates held their faces, the careful stillness of beings choosing not to speak yet. A calculation was being made, not out loud, not publicly. But it was being made. Greel said nothing. He had come to this session and he sat in his seat and he listened. He had stopped expecting his words to change outcomes. He was here to watch and to remember. After the session, in the corridor with windows, Zara was waiting for him with another report. She had been collecting every piece of data she could find from every source she had access to, building the same picture Greel was building, from the inside. "They hit the staging base," she said. "Which one?" "All three." Greel sat down. "Simultaneously," she continued. 6 hours after the main engagement. They hit all three outer system staging bases at the same time. The bases are either destroyed or disabled. The repair crews for HFY's 6 damaged ships that were sitting there, they're gone." She paused. "He's also lost the supply depot at position 7. His fleet is now operating without a reliable resupply point in the system." Greel looked at his hands. "They planned it from the beginning," he said. "It was not a question. The 12-ship engagement, the retreat. They planned to let HFY think his advance was proceeding. They let him move before the reinforcement fleet arrived so his force would be isolated when the real fleet came out. He thought through the sequence. And then they hit the bases while his attention was on the withdrawal, while his remaining ships were in disarray, while his crews were managing damage and casualties, and had no attention left for anything outside the immediate crisis." Zara sat down across from him. She was quiet for a moment. "They set a trap," she said. "They set several traps," he said, "one inside another. The 12 ships were bait. The clear approach path was bait. The early withdrawal to make HFY feel ahead of schedule was bait." He looked at the report. "Someone planned this whole sequence before the first shot was fired." He thought about Admiral Chen Wei, whose name had appeared twice in human communications that the Council's intelligence had partially decrypted. He did not know this person. He had only a name and a rank and a photograph from a human public record, a quiet-faced man with gray at his temples and a scar on his jaw who had apparently been running Earth's defense planning for the past 3 years. 3 years, since before the territorial dispute had even reached the Council formally. Since before anyone had voted on anything. "He saw this coming before we did," Greel said. "The human admiral. He started preparing for this before the Council filed the complaint, before the vote, before the fleet was authorized." Greel set the report down. He watched the territorial dispute developing, understood how the Council would respond and built his response to the response, before we had finished debating. Zara was very still. "Then we were always behind," she said. "We were always behind," Greel confirmed. "The Council has been making decisions inside a plan that a human military commander wrote for them without their knowledge." On Lunar Station, Chen Wei stood in the operations room and watched the staging base reports come in. All three confirmed, clean, the timing had been exact. HFY came in from the secondary briefing, still in her flight suit, her hair pulled back and her expression carrying the focused energy of someone who had spent 4 hours in the middle of a major engagement and come out the other side with her ship intact. She crossed the room and stood next to him at the display. "They'll send more," she said, not worried, stating a fact. "Yes," Chen Wei said. "How many more can they send before it starts hurting their other commitments?" "I've been modeling that." He pulled up the projection he had been working on for the past 6 hours. It was built on everything they had learned about the Keth fleet disposition, where their other vessels were committed, what their typical reserve ratios looked like, how long they could sustain a major engagement in one system without weakening their position somewhere else. They have capacity for maybe 3 more major pushes before their other commitments start showing gaps. HFY studied the projection, and we need to still be fighting when the gaps appear. We need to still be fighting, and we need to be making sure the rest of the Council is watching, Chen Wei said. The Keth are carrying this operation. Other species in the Council are already spending resources they didn't plan to spend. If this goes long enough and expensive enough, some of them are going to start asking why they're paying for a Keth territorial dispute. You think the council will fracture? I think the council is a political body, Chen Wei said, and political bodies respond to cost. He looked at the display. We can't beat 60 Keth warships in a straight fight, but we don't have to. We have to make this expensive enough that someone in that chamber decides it's cheaper to negotiate than continue. And if they don't? Chen Wei thought about that for a moment. Then we keep making it expensive, he said. We keep making it expensive until the math changes. Akaffer nodded slowly. She looked at the display for another moment, then at him. You expected this from the start, this whole sequence. I hoped the council would negotiate before it got here. He said honestly, there was a window. 6 months ago, there was a window where formal dialogue could have resolved the territorial boundary question without any of this. He paused. They voted to send 40 ships instead. Why? Chen Wei looked at the Keth fleet position marker on the display. What remained of it? What had started as 40 and was now 17, sitting cold and battered in the outer system. Because they looked at us, he said, and they saw something small. One planet, a few colony ships, a handful of vessels. They saw something that looked easy to manage. He straightened. They didn't understand that small and manageable are different things. He turned from the display. Get your crew rested. The reinforcement fleet arrives in 4 days. We'll need to be ready. The reinforcement fleet dropped out of FTL on schedule. 20 ships, fresh and fully armed, arriving at the rendezvous point where they expected to find HFY's fleet intact and the operation proceeding. They found 17 damaged ships and a commander whose report had already told the council most of it, but whose face, when the fleet commander of the reinforcements made visual contact, told the rest. The reinforcement fleet commander was a young Keth officer named Seville. She was ambitious and capable and had been looking forward to this assignment because it was supposed to be the kind of operation that built careers. Straightforward, clean, a Class 3 civilization, easy to manage. She looked at the damage reports on HFY's ships and at the empty positions on the tactical map, where 3 staging bases used to be, and she understood immediately that nothing about this assignment was going to be what she had expected. She sent a message to HFY. He replied in one sentence, "Do not advance until you have read everything." She read everything. It took 4 hours. When she was done, she sat in her command chair and looked at the star chart and thought about the Tharan ambassador's warning, which she had heard about second-hand through council gossip, and which she had not taken seriously because it was the kind of thing old delegates said about young species. Sentimental overcaution, historical hand-wringing. She understood now what he had actually been saying. She sent a message to the council, not a report, a request. She requested authorization to open a direct communication channel with the humans for the purpose of beginning formal negotiations. The council's response arrived 6 hours later. It denied the request. It authorized her to proceed with the correction operation, using combined fleet assets. Seville read the authorization. She looked at the 37 ships she now commanded, between her 20 and HFY's surviving 17. She looked at the position data for the human fleet, which her sensors confirmed was already moving, already repositioning, already somewhere other than where it had been. She thought, they know we got the reinforcements. They've already adjusted for it. She sent one more message to the council, a final professional note, very short. It said, I want it formally recorded that I believe this approach will result in further significant losses, and that I recommend immediate diplomatic engagement. The council noted her concern. She began the advance. Somewhere in the asteroid belt, 40 human ships that had spent the last 4 days resting, resupplying, and incorporating everything they had learned from the previous engagement into new tactical plans, finished their preparations. Commander HFY checked her weapon systems one final time. "All stations ready," her officer reported. "Good," she said. They went to meet the fleet. The second engagement lasted 6 hours and cost the combined Keth fleet 31 ships. HFY's remaining force broke first, not because he ordered it, because his ships were already damaged and the crews inside them were already tired and had already used most of what they had. They scattered when the line collapsed, and a scattered ship is a dying ship, and his crews knew it, and they ran because running was the only option left that was not dying. Seville held together longer. She was a better commander in a fresh ship with a rested crew. She found a formation that could sustain fire, and she held it for 2 hours past the point where HFY had broken, fighting with the focused intensity of someone who understood that the report she was going to have to write afterward would define the rest of her career, and she was going to make sure it at least reflected that she had tried. In the end, it did not matter how hard she tried. She ordered the withdrawal with 9 ships left. 9 ships from 37. She pulled them to the outer edge of the system and stopped there and looked at the readouts and did not say anything for a long time. Her tactical officer broke the silence. "They're not pursuing," she said, surprised. "The human fleet stopped at the engagement boundary. They're not coming after us." Seville thought about that. The humans had 9 ships on the wrong side of that boundary that were easy targets. They had the momentum and the firepower and the positioning to destroy every remaining Keth vessel in the system. They could have finished this completely. They had chosen not to. "Why?" her officer asked. Seville did not answer immediately. She had read everything HFY had given her. She had read the Tharan ambassador's session record. She had 3 hours of very bad recent experience to add to that. She thought she understood the answer. The humans were not trying to destroy them. They were trying to make a point. Destroying all 9 ships meant a war to the end, one side or the other. Letting 9 ships limp home meant those 9 ships arrived at the council with a report, and a report was a message, and the message was, "Look at what we just did, and understand that we chose to stop." It was worse than destruction. It was a demonstration. She sent her report to the council and began the long, quiet transit back. The council chamber was not quiet when the report arrived. It was the opposite of quiet. Every delegate was talking, and most of them were talking loudly, and several of them were not talking to each other but into personal communication devices to their home governments. 3 delegations had already called emergency sessions of their own separate councils. The Duvani representative had left the chamber entirely for 6 hours and come back looking like he had been in a very long conversation with very unhappy people. Voss sat in the primary seat and maintained the expression of someone who was in control of the situation. He had been maintaining this expression for 4 days. The maintenance was becoming visible. Greel sat in his seat and watched. 59 vessels, Drawl of the Seine said from his station. He was reading numbers from a display, and his voice had the careful flatness of someone trying to stay analytical while being very alarmed. "We have committed and lost 59 vessels since this operation began, against a Class 3 civilization that had, on the day we voted, fewer than 20 deep space ships on record." "The intelligence assessment was incomplete," Voss said. "The intelligence assessment was incomplete because they built their real fleet in secret while we were having the debate about sending ships," Drawl said. "Which means they anticipated our decision before we made it. Which means they are more sophisticated than the Class 3 designation suggested," Voss said. "We update the designation. We respond with appropriate force." Voss, Atrath of the Duvani, had come back to his seat, and he was not using his polite voice anymore. "We have spent 59 ships. The humans have lost ships as well, but their ratio is dramatically in their favor, and they appear to be producing replacement vessels faster than we are committing them. At what point does the Council accept that this approach is not working? It is working, Voss said, slowly. It is not working, Atrath said simply. It is the opposite of working. It is providing the humans with combat experience, tactical data, and a steady supply of captured and analyzed Keth technology. Every engagement teaches them something. Every ship we lose gives them something to study. We are not winning. We are educating them. The chamber was divided. Greel could feel it the way you feel weather changing. Some delegates were with Voss, the Keth allies, the species who had been inside the Council's inner circle long enough to feel that their prestige was tied to the outcome. Others were starting to separate, starting to do the calculation between Council solidarity on one side and their own military resources and economic commitments on the other. Two delegations had already quietly recalled their symbolic support ships from the operation. Not publicly. Not yet, but they were gone. Greel rose. The room settled. He had not spoken in 2 sessions. He had let the events speak instead. I would like to propose, he said, that the Council authorize a direct diplomatic communication with the human government, not a correction notice, not a demand, a genuine communication opening with the stated purpose of negotiating a resolution to the territorial dispute. Voss looked at him. The operation is ongoing. Yes, Greel said. That is why I think we should do it now, while we still have something to negotiate from. In 4 more engagements at this ratio, we will not be the party setting the terms of the conversation. The chamber was silent. The humans stopped pursuing 9 of our ships, Greel said. They had the capacity to destroy them and they did not. That is a message. They are telling us the same thing they told us in their very first response. They are not trying to start a war. They are trying to make us understand that a war with them is not what we think it is. He looked around the chamber. I think we should respond to that message before they decide we are not receiving it. Voss considered this for a long moment. Then, I will authorize a communication channel, informational, not a negotiation. An informational channel is a beginning, Greel said. He would take it. The message went to the human government 4 hours later. Greel drafted it himself, in careful language, choosing every word with the attention he might give to a document that would be read by historians. He said, the Council wished to open a communication channel. He said, the Council acknowledged that the territorial dispute had escalated beyond what was intended. He said, the Council was prepared to discuss the matter through diplomatic means. He did not say, we are losing. He did not say, we are frightened of what you will do next. He did not say, we should have listened 3 months ago. The reply came back in 2 hours. It was from Admiral Chen Wei directly, not from a diplomatic office, not from a government agency, from the Admiral. It said, we are prepared to communicate. We want to be honest about our position. We are not interested in returning to the state of affairs before this conflict began. We are willing to discuss a new arrangement that addresses both the territorial question and the broader question of Earth's standing in relation to the Council. We suggest that Ambassador Greel of the Tharan serve as the primary contact, as we have found his public statements to be honest. We will await his direct communication. Greel read it twice, 3 times. They had read his session speech. They had decided he was the one worth talking to. He thought about Voss, about how Voss would receive this. A Keth military operation, and the humans were asking to negotiate with a Tharan. He went to Voss's office and told him. Voss's expression stayed flat. His hands briefly did not. They want to negotiate with you, Voss said. Yes. Not with the Council leadership. Not with the Council leadership, Greel confirmed. With me. Voss looked at him for a long moment. Greel could not read everything in that look. There was something complicated in it. And you think this is a good faith offer? I think, Greel said carefully, that the humans choose their words with great precision when the situation is serious. They said they want to be honest. They said they are not interested in returning to the previous arrangement. They are telling us exactly what they intend. He paused. I think this is the most good faith offer we are going to receive, and I think the window for it is shorter than we would like. Voss gave his authorization. Greel sent his reply that evening. The reply came back from Chen Wei 6 hours later, and it was longer than Greel had expected. The admiral wrote clearly and without ceremony. He laid out the human position in plain terms. The humans did not recognize the Council's authority over the territorial zones in question. They had reviewed the legal framework the Keth fleet had sent in its original correction notice, and their analysis was that the applicable charter provisions had been written 300 years ago by Council members who had not imagined species like humanity expanding into space, and that several of the jurisdictional boundaries were legally questionable on the basis of the Charter's own internal definitions. They were not asking to be left alone. They were asking to be recognized. A seat at the Council table, a formal role in the governance frameworks that determined territorial boundaries, and a guarantee, written, binding, enforceable, that the Council would not treat human expansion into unclaimed space as a violation requiring military correction. In exchange, they would stop. They had the capacity to continue. They had built enough ships in the past 8 months and learned enough from each engagement to make the next 6 months of fighting considerably worse for the Council than the first 3 had been. Chen Wei said this not as a threat but as a fact. In the same tone, you state the weather. And they were choosing to stop, if the Council would have the conversation. Greel read the message and felt something release in his chest that had been tight for 4 months. He went to the Council chamber with the full text. He read it aloud. He watched the faces. Atrath of the Duvani had his eyes closed and was nodding very slowly. Dral of the Sen was already making notes. Voss sat perfectly still. They want a seat, Voss said when Greel finished. Yes. They are a Class 3 civilization. We do not give Council seats to Class 3 civilizations. They have destroyed or disabled 68 of our vessels in 90 days, Atrath said quietly, with a fleet they built in secret in 8 months, on top of a Class 3 designation. He opened his eyes. Perhaps the classification needs to be reconsidered. Voss was quiet for a long time. If we give them a seat, he said finally, every other species watching this will read it as a concession. They will read it as the Council being forced backward by a single system. They would be correct, Greel said. We were. The question is whether we accept that fact now and negotiate from what position we have left, or whether we continue until the position we have left is considerably smaller. The chamber sat with that. 3 days later, a Keth patrol in the outer system picked up movement on their long-range sensors. Not from Earth's direction. From behind them. 3 human ships had come through the FTL point that the Keth fleet used as its primary approach corridor from Keth space. The same corridor the reinforcement fleet had come through. The corridor that led back to Keth home systems. They were not attacking. They were sitting there, running no weapons, broadcasting openly. They broadcast one message, on a clear frequency, to the Keth fleet in the system and to any Council relay within range. The message said, "We are demonstrating that we know where this corridor leads. We are not using it. We are going home now. We look forward to the diplomatic conversation." Then they turned around and left. HFY, still in the outer system with his 9 damaged ships, received the message and sat with it for a very long time. They had been behind him. They had come through his supply corridor and sat in his rear approach and sent a polite message and left. They could have done anything. They had done nothing. Because the point was not what they did. The point was that they could. He sent one final report to the Council. It was the shortest report he had ever written. It was 3 sentences. They have been behind our lines. They chose not to act on it. We should talk to them. He did not know if anyone in the council chamber would listen. But Greel would read it. And that, HFY thought, might be enough. The vote to open formal negotiations passed by 41 to 29. It was not a comfortable majority. 2 delegations abstained rather than vote against Voss openly. Several species that had been with the Keth from the beginning voted yes, with expressions that made clear they were doing so because the math had changed, and not because their opinion had. Voss voted yes. He did it without explanation and without ceremony. He set his hand on the authorization panel and let the vote register, and then sat in the primary seat and looked at nothing in particular. Greel had been watching Voss for 60 years in one capacity or another. He knew the difference between the various kinds of silence this man was capable of. This one was the silence of someone who had gone through the door on one side of the argument and understood, now that he was all the way through, that he was in a different room than he had expected. It was not defeat exactly, it was something adjacent to it. Something that sat in the same neighborhood. Greel voted yes, and then walked out of the chamber and found Zara in the corridor. It passed, she said. She had been watching the live feed on her device. Yes. She let out a breath. So it's over. The fighting is over, Greel said. What comes next is harder in some ways. Harder than 68 ships in 90 days. Harder for the Council, he said, because what comes next requires the Council to genuinely change, not adjust, not make a small concession and return to how things were. Change. He began walking toward the communication center, where the delegation contact setup was already being arranged. The humans said they are not interested in returning to the previous arrangement. They meant that in every sense. Zara fell into step beside him. Do you think they'll be reasonable in the actual talks? Greel thought about the message from Chen Wei, the precision of it, the way each paragraph said exactly what it meant and nothing more. The fact that they had sent 3 ships through the Keth supply corridor and then left without firing a single weapon, choosing demonstration over destruction when destruction was available. I think, he said, that the humans are very good at being reasonable when they are being treated as equals, and I think they have spent 3 months making a very thorough argument for being treated as equals. He paused at the corridor junction. The question is whether the Council is capable of hearing that argument now. The first direct communication session between Greel and Admiral Chen Wei took place via secure channel across a distance of 42 light hours. The delay in signal transit made conversation slow, each message taking nearly 2 days for a round trip, but both sides had agreed to this method before arranging any in-person meeting. Greel had suggested it. He wanted a record of everything, built up carefully, before anyone sat in the same room. Chen Wei's first message was brief. He said he appreciated the Council's decision to negotiate. He said the humans had no interest in expanding this conflict further. He said that the outcome they wanted was a stable and defined relationship, not dominance, not tribute, not special privilege above other species. A recognized place in the structure that already existed, with the legal protection that came from that recognition. He also said something that Greel read several times. He said, "We want to be honest about something. We did not want this war. We were aware for approximately 3 years that the Council was likely to respond to our expansion with some form of corrective action. We spent those 3 years preparing because preparation was responsible governance. We would have preferred to spend those same 3 years in a diplomatic process that avoided all of this. That option was not offered to us. We are not making this point to assign blame. We are making it because we think it is important that the future arrangement includes mechanisms for early dialogue, so that the next species the Council encounters with a different developmental path than expected has somewhere to bring that conversation before it becomes a fleet action." Greel read the last paragraph twice more. Not just asking for a seat at the table, asking for the table to work differently, for other species that came after them. He replied carefully, because he wanted to be equally honest. He told Chen Wei that he had warned the council and been overruled. He said it plainly, with no diplomatic softening. He thought the humans deserved the plain version. He said the council's decision-making structure had genuine problems that predated this conflict, and that the humans were not wrong to identify them. He said he would advocate for the changes they were describing, and that he could not promise success, but that he would try. Chen Wei's reply came back 2 days later. It said that's all we're asking of anyone, that they try. The formal negotiation sessions were held on a neutral station, the Veth platform, which sat in unclaimed space roughly equidistant from Earth and the nearest Keth system. It had been built 300 years ago for exactly this kind of purpose, and had hosted 9 major interspecies conferences since then. It had never hosted a species that had fought its way to the table. Greel represented the council. 2 other ambassadors flanked him, Wrath of the Duvani and Draal of the Sen, both of whom had broken with Voss's position in the final sessions. Voss had not come. He had sent a deputy with authority to sign agreements, which was practical and also the specific kind of absence that said everything about where things stood. The human delegation arrived on the 2nd day of the scheduled conference window, exactly on time. Admiral Chen Wei led them. He brought 3 others, a diplomat from the human civilian government, a legal specialist, and Commander Akafer, who sat at the end of the table and said almost nothing during the sessions but whose presence Greel understood. She was there to remind the council delegation of something, quietly, without saying a word. Chen Wei was shorter than Greel had expected. Human images did not always translate well to a sense of physical scale. He shook hands, a human greeting gesture involving the right hand with each council delegate, and when he reached Greel, he held the handshake a moment longer than the others and said, simply, "Thank you for reading us correctly." "I wish it had mattered sooner," Greel said. Chen Wei looked at him steadily. "It mattered. It just took a while for the situation to agree with you." They sat down. The talks lasted 9 days. There were difficult moments. The question of the territorial boundaries was genuinely complex. Not every claim the humans made was clear-cut, and not every council position was without merit. There were 2 sessions that ended early because the conversation had reached a point where both sides needed time to think before anyone said something that made the next session harder. There was one moment, on the 6th day, when a council legal aide challenged a specific jurisdictional argument with language that was technically accurate and also deeply condescending, and Commander Akafer leaned forward and said, in a very quiet voice, "I would like to point out that this is the same jurisdictional framework that was used to authorize the fleet that we destroyed." And the room was very still for a moment before Chen Wei put a hand briefly on her arm and said nothing. And the legal aide reconsidered his phrasing. Greel watched all of it. He contributed where he could. He kept the language from becoming weapons more than twice. He was good at that, 60 years of practice at knowing when to speak and when to let the silence do the work. On the 9th day, they signed an agreement. The terms were not what the Keth had wanted. They were not a full victory for the humans either. That was the nature of an agreement reached after combat rather than before it. The edges were jagged. The compromises were real on both sides, and nobody left the table feeling entirely satisfied. But they left the table. The territorial boundary was redrawn to reflect a negotiated line that gave the humans the space their colony ships had reached and established a formal process for future expansion claims. The humans received associate status in the council, not a full voting seat, but a recognized standing with the right to speak, the right to challenge decisions that affected them, and a clear pathway to full membership. The Council agreed to establish an early contact diplomatic channel for newly discovered or rapidly developing species. It was written into the structure quietly, almost as an administrative measure, not given much attention in the public summaries of the agreement. Greel thought it might be the most important thing they signed. On the last evening before the delegations departed, Greel sat in a small observation room on the outer ring of the Veth platform. It had windows, large ones, floor to ceiling. He sat looking at the stars for a long time. He heard footsteps, and then Chen Wei was standing at the window beside him. Neither of them said anything for a while. The admiral had his hands clasped behind his back and was looking at the same stars, though Greel supposed they were looking at different things within them. "There's something I've been wanting to ask you," Chen Wei said eventually. "Yes. Your warning to the council, at the beginning. You said we don't surrender, you said we don't stop." He paused. "That's accurate, but it's only part of it. Did you know the other part?" Greel considered the question. He had spent 3 years studying this species before speaking in that chamber. He had read more human history than most non-humans ever had. "I had a theory," he said. "I chose not to present it, because I thought the council wouldn't understand it, and it would weaken the parts they could." "What was the theory?" "You don't stop," Greel said, "but you also don't need to. You stop when the problem is genuinely solved, not when it's suppressed, not when the other side is broken and can't continue. When the actual problem, the real disagreement underneath the fighting, is addressed." He looked at the stars. "You held your ships back when you had HFY's remnant force in range. You sent 3 ships through his supply corridor and then left. You came to the table and you negotiated in good faith." He paused. "You do not fight for the sake of winning. You fight until the thing that caused the fight is fixed." Chen Wei was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's a generous reading of human history." "It is consistent with the record," Greel said. "We also have a lot of wars that didn't end that way." "Yes," Greel said, "you also have those." Chen Wei made a sound that might have been a short laugh. "I'm not sure if you're being diplomatic or honest." "With me," Greel said, "those are the same thing most of the time." They stood at the window a while longer. The stars did not move. They never did from inside, which was why Greel had always found looking at them restful rather than disorienting. The universe stayed where it was. It was everything inside the rooms that moved. "What happens now?" Chen Wei asked. Not for himself, Greel understood that, for the larger picture. "The Keth will take time to accept this," Greel said. "The Council will be uncomfortable for several years. Some species will test the new framework. Some will try to use the humans as leverage in their own old disputes, which will not go well for them." He paused. "And slowly, very slowly, the structure will change. It always does when something genuinely new arrives in it." "Good new or bad new?" New, Greel said. "The evaluation takes time." Chen Wei nodded slowly. "We're going to be a difficult species to have in the council." "Almost certainly," Greel agreed. "Does that bother you?" Greel thought about 60 years in a chamber with no windows, watching confident beings make bad decisions, watching careful warnings get set aside for the reassurance of being in charge, watching the galaxy managed by people who were very good at managing things that stayed still. He thought about a species that had fought itself for 10,000 years and never stopped, but also never stopped building cities over battlefields, roads through the debris, schools in the gaps between conflicts, adding and adding even while destroying, never quite letting the destroying win. He thought about a young Tharan aide named Zara, who would inherit the council he left behind, and would need it to be different from the one he had arrived in. "No," he said honestly, "it does not bother me." Zara met him at the transport dock when he returned to the main council station. She had been managing the delegation's affairs in his absence, and had the look of someone who had slept less than was medically recommended, but had made excellent use of the time. She had a full briefing ready, reactions from council member species, initial public responses from human media, HFY's formal retirement announcement submitted quietly the day before, Voss's statement, which was professionally worded and said nothing. "Also," she said, 3 separate junior delegations have already requested information on the new early contact channel." Already, they want to know how it works, whether it applies to them, whether they can use it for existing disputes. She paused. One of them specifically asked whether the channel would be reviewed by someone who would actually read what they sent. Greel felt something in his chest that took him a moment to identify. It was unfamiliar, not because he had never felt it before, but because he had not felt it in some time. Something like hope, but older than hope, something more patient. "Tell them it will be reviewed," he said. "Tell them to send what they have." He walked down the corridor toward his office, toward the window he worked beside every day, the one he had been pressing his palm against for 4 months while the battle reports came in, and the votes went the wrong way, and the fleet numbers mounted in the wrong direction. He stood at the window now and looked at the stars. The chamber behind him had windows too now, or it would. That had been in the agreement. A small thing, easy to miss in the list of territorial terms and membership provisions and legal frameworks. A renovation request almost. Windows installed in the council chamber proper. The humans had asked for it specifically. When Greel had asked Chen Wei why, the Admiral had said, "So that whoever is in that room making decisions remembers that there's something outside it, that the galaxy is bigger than the argument on the table. It helps, sometimes, to be able to see it." Greel had included it in the draft without debate. He stood at his own window and looked at the stars, and at the small patch of sky where, if his charts were right, a yellow sun was burning in the midrim with a blue planet turning around it. A species that had fought itself for 10,000 years, that had poisoned its own land and rebuilt it, that had built weapons to end itself and then decided not to use them, that had seen 40 warships in its home system and sent 12 older ships to block the approach vector. 12 ships that were not a defense, that were a message. "We are still here. We are not moving. Come talk to us like we matter, or learn the hard way what we're capable of when you don't." He had delivered that message to the council 4 months ago, in a chamber with no windows, and they had noted his concern and sent the fleet anyway. And now there would be windows. It was not everything, but it was a beginning. He stood there until the light changed, and then he sat down at his desk and began drafting his report, the full account, start to finish, every decision and every ignored warning and every engagement and every step of the 9 days on the Veth platform. The document he had started building in his mind on the day the vote was taken, and the fleet was authorized, and he had walked back to his seat and told Zara, "We document everything." Someone would read it someday. A young diplomat maybe, a xenobiologist studying first contact records, or another old ambassador from another old species, sitting in a chamber somewhere and watching a confident vote go the wrong way and standing up to say something that nobody wanted to hear. He wrote it all down. Every word. All of it true. He owed them that much.